Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Illusive Networks webinar, a CISO roundtable on ransomware, insider threat, and what to do about it. We are very excited to have an all-star CISO panel with us today. And I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Ofer Israeli, who's the CEO and founder of Illusive in 1 minute. But before I do that, I'll just make a couple of preliminary announcements. One, today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of the recording in your email inbox likely tomorrow morning. Two, we will reserve time for questions at the end of today's session from the audience. You can ask questions in the Q&A panel in the Q&A tab on your webinar control panel. And I encourage you to ask questions during throughout the webinar as something is top of mind, and we will monitor the questions and then reserve time to answer them in the last 10, 15 minutes or so of today's session. So with all that said, I'm going to turn things over now to Ofer Israeli. Ofer, over to you.
Thank you, Jason, and good morning or good evening, dependent on where you all are. Super excited for the webinar we have in front of us, where, as Jason mentioned, we have an extremely talented set of individuals which will be participating and discussing their views of the world. So introducing briefly, we have with us Arlen McMillan, which is a CISO at Kirkland & Ellis, one of the leading global law firms, and I believe the largest by revenue in the world. Alongside that, has carried multiple CISO hats in other industries as well, United Airlines, City of Chicago, and in the banking world. And thank you for joining us, Arlen. We have Carl Madsen, who is the CISO at PennyMac in the mortgage lending business, as you all know, and previously the CISO of City National Bank for many years. And Cooper Wilson, Director of Global Cybersecurity at Darling Ingredients, global developers and suppliers of sustainable natural ingredients, and previously major consulting firms that did some government work. So outside of the unique perspectives and interesting backgrounds these folks have, there's also an element of leadership and such that if there's a time for leadership, 2020 is probably it. So we're super happy to have this extremely talented and gifted group of individuals with us today. Thank you all for participating. So with that, let's kick it off. First of all, as mentioned, 2020 has been quite a ride for everybody. We've all gone through these tremendous changes from we're all in the office, the next day we're all at home and things need to work and they need to work quickly through a threat landscape that has evolved and changed. And I'd like to get your perspectives in terms of what it's like to lead cybersecurity teams and what it's like to look at our defense in a different way, given the new circumstances. So Arlen, if you wanna share your thoughts there.
Sure. Thanks, Ofer, for having me and us talk about this. And I think our experiences, my experience, have been similar to many other organizations. We've always had people that traveled. We always had a portion of our assets off of our trusted, secure network. And in that regard, not much has changed, right? We still have people on, but most are off. And the biggest change there and how we think about risk is, instead of 5% traveling, we now have maybe 95% quote unquote traveling and off the trusted network and living constantly on networks that we don't manage and trust. So that's forced a little bit of a rethink in how we've not only deploying our security, but also how we're tuning our devices and how we're setting up our behavioral analysis. Behavioral analysis kind of went out the window when everybody's behavior changed. So how we're protecting the assets, how we're setting up our alerting, monitoring, and response, and also how are we balancing security risk with operational needs. There's quite a few things that we had to do very rapidly to ensure that the business was operating at a peak effectiveness, and that required making some choices. So looking at all of that new world with this kind of risk lens it forced everybody into a little bit of a rethink. I think we're good, but it required a bit of a forced rethink.
Yeah, absolutely. And Carl, I know that throughout this year you've made a transition and you joined PennyMac in the middle of this craziness that we're going through. What was that like, hopping on board in the midst of this crisis?
Well, when I joined, I think that I had missed the moment in time that most companies went through where they were rapidly transitioning to a remote workforce. And so there was that sort of wave of change that happened very, very quickly. But I think for most organizations, and ours is included, there's a second wave of change that has not subsided, and that's basically the speed of public cloud adoption and speed of digital transformation. So while that first sort of wave of change happens, the second wave of change really on the core network and the core infrastructure, core platforms. So we're in the midst of that, and I think most organizations are as well. And so I think what that does is that accelerated pace of change is not subsiding in the near future. So I think what it does is it very much places a stress on the security team to adjust accordingly. That stress, in some cases, has a really good silver lining, which is it prompts us to really think hard about our processes and workflows and being efficient and perhaps even chasing out a lot of inefficiencies that we may have had in place before, but really focusing on the core workflow and processes that we have in place. And then the second thing I think was a silver lining here, and this is very much an individual basis, irrespective of the company, is there are some employees who really have now an open door to work remotely, work from locations that they enjoy working from, or they avoid commutes. And so in some respects, there are individual members of the team who are really thriving in this capacity of work remote. So as a security leader, I'm thinking more about things like the team's sort of work from home environment, chairs and monitors and things like that, to make sure that every individual person is sort of set up for success. And those are things that maybe I just didn't have to pay attention to when we were all in the office and we all got the sort of same standard stuff. But in a lot of ways, there are a lot of individuals who are really thriving in this sort of environment, and so that's a silver lining that I think we're seeing late this year.
Absolutely, and I imagine part of that being the fact that we've all got accustomed to work from home now. It also opens up the opportunity to hire elsewhere, and maybe
Absolutely.
where we were more limited in the past, we could really go after that scarce talent that could be in any other location now. And
if I just add a quick note, I joined my PennyMac in August, and I have yet to meet a single person in the organization face to face. And so, as a security leader, just like across the business, we're sort of learning to integrate new employees. We're learning to create communication habits that are entirely different than those that we had employed a year ago. So, a lot of new features of being a security manager that are just we're not really present for the teams in an older construct that now are top priorities for the way that we deliberately handle one-on-ones, the way that we handle things like status updates and project updates, those types of things. We sort of have to re-architect ourselves as a team to make sure that the communications themselves are effective and efficient.
Absolutely. And Cooper, could you share from your experience how much this has impacted how you run security at the business and what kind of changes you had to make in that regard?
Sure. I think there's, from a challenge perspective, I think something that we realized right away was that many of our tools lost some fidelity. I know, like many people, we rely on layers of security, layers of alerts and alarms and logs. And when we went to a single thread to the outside, it created some fidelity loss, which immediately created some concerns for us and how we were going to respond to it. And unfortunately, it led to people working longer to find more data. Right? So we had to roll people back and go, look, I understand you want to stick with this, especially working from home. It went from an 8 or 9 hour day to sometimes 12 to 14 hours for these folks, and it just had to make them go to bed. But I think another thing that hit us in the challenge was that our third parties had to work from home too. So normally when those folks would be running from a secure way into a secure way to get to us from their own systems in their own networks and their own security bastions, they too were challenged to go home. And some of them were working remotely on home PCs, contacting, trying to do their jobs. So our third parties were in a globally distributed company. There are a lot of third parties. So we had to do some understanding that we couldn't ask them just to come in and do the work behind the walls of our security. We were actually stretching ourselves into the work from home was not as challenging for us from a corporate perspective as it was for supply chain and third-party vendors.
Yeah, third-party risk is on steroids now with the fact that we've had to open up to every place and every location. Absolutely. So that's a good segue into one of the things that we're seeing quite a lot in the last several years, honestly, but it keeps on hitting us harder and harder year over year, and certainly over the last year, is the rise of ransomware in general and targeted ransomware specifically. And we've seen it all with Cognizant and Travelex, and most recently Foxconn, which I believe there's a ransom note out for $34 million. So the prices, the ransoms are increasing. The amount of attacks is increasing, and it seems that it's challenging for us as a security industry to really get a handle on this, and everybody seems to be a target now. Can you talk a bit about your purview of how this threat has evolved and how we should evolve our security thinking around how ransomware is now manifested?
If I can jump in, Aon just recently published a report on this, and I forget the exact numbers, but it's around 30 million now. They're starting to see some of that top tier costs or ransoms being demanded, and the increase in how many incidents are out there in the world is just going through the roof. I don't know how many years now we've been dealing with this thing called ransomware. And it doesn't seem to be going away. It just seems to be getting worse. So I don't see this going away anytime soon. And why should it, right? It's working. Bad guys keep on making a lot of money off this because they keep on finding organizations that aren't able to stop it, right? And how do you do that? You do that through not only standard good cyber hygiene, right? Patch, super important. Manage your creds. Have a good strategy on managing creds which may be common across multiple boxes. We all have that standard IT desktop support cred that exists on all these endpoints, and boy, I hope it's not the same password, else you're in for a bad day. Then there's segmentation, and traditional segmentation techniques really don't work. Right? When you have your user network all on maybe the same network or a couple networks, ransomware will just go like wildfire and take all your assets if it gets in your environment. So traditional segmentation techniques generally aren't working. So, we're doing all of those things. We're bringing in micro-segmentation all the way down to the endpoint. Each endpoint is now being isolated. And we're doing other things like putting fake creds out there to act as tripwires. So, the standard attacker behavior, get in through a phishing email or similar, leverage a known vuln, get on the box, scrape your creds, use those creds, see where they can be used, how far lateral they can move with it. And if they pop that one cred which has access on multiple boxes, well, that's a bad day for the organization. So understanding that that's the standard attack process, kill chain, whatever you can do to disrupt it or see it more quickly will give you a chance to respond and stop it. I think putting out fake creds is a part of that process that we find it pretty effective.
So is it fair to say what I'm hearing from you is that throughout this problem, it has kind of raised the need to ensure nobody's moving around in the network. Lateral movement is not occurring, and there's multiple things that go into it, between cleansing up the environment, micro-segmentation, to deceiving, multiple aspects that could stop that attack.
Yeah, I remember when really the thinking was that the user networks was the swamp, and it was a lost cause, right? And the only way to protect your network is to go into a fallback position and protect your data center, protect your core assets, and just assume that your user network was lost. So I think a lot of security leaders that have still, whether they're not really thinking that way or not, that's still kind of embedded in the thinking of security. And unfortunately, that thinking doesn't work. You have to extend the perimeter. I think, it's real interesting what Carl and Cooper were talking about extending the perimeter all the way to the home, rethinking that. And making sure that you're really protecting your laptops, your endpoint assets, just as you would, or very similarly, how you're protecting your data center is just got to be critical part of your overall strategy.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Cooper, are you seeing things similar to this? Are you seeing additional strategies that need to be implemented?
Well, I think everybody recognizes that the way to success for these guys is by compromising the people who do that normally, right? So live off the land, lateral movements, stuff. It doesn't take much to pull up MITRE and see which is the smallest stack on the attack chain, right? And see where, if you were going to shape, and that's what you need to do, because as you look at this and as you see the way that these folks do what they do, they typically want to use identities and systems and people and processes that are trusted, right? That's supposed to happen. Yeah, they do that. That's always the question you get. And once you get to that point, you realize that you're now defending against yourself. So you need to stop that, turn it around and go, once they're inside, once they're in the user base, once they're inside the perimeter, they're on your territory. And now you can shape the battlefield. And when you do that, you need to funnel them where you need to have the highest success. And so if you use things like MITRE and other tools and just experience about how this works, I think you'll find deceptions and decoys. And I think you'll find, aviaries and all kinds of things that you can do once you start saying, hey, I want to manage my battleground to be the most advantageous for me. With the, we always talk about things like assume breach, and we talk about things like live off the land. But I think once you start seeing that it's become personal and it's really focused on the people who do that normally, then it really starts to obscure. So change your way of thinking and change your battlefield to be more advantageous to you.
Yeah, I love that. It's even at the emotional level, kind of getting us away from the victim approach to taking control and being able to set the ground and set the playing field to our advantage, to your point. And clearly, it's clearly something needs to change. The paradigm needs to change, because doing the same thing over and over hasn't succeeded for us. So, love the way you're thinking about it. Carl, any insights on your end?
Yeah, just one thing I would sort of add is the human psychology element, and I think that what I see and what I feel is that we have operational pressures and security teams to keep business operating and moving, and employees feel compelled to act with speed and with purpose. And so I think that there's when we talk about insider threat, I also want us not to forget about just the accidents that happen. And so I think that like unforced errors that employees making and security teams are making, just as a virtue of the speed that we're trying to work at, the speed we're trying to change at, it creates a lot of sort of unforced errors. And those unforced errors result in sort of insider loss. They result in misconfigurations when we're moving at such speed. And I think that element, to me, as much as the technical piece, is I think worries me, because even with sound sort of technical intentions, or users who are intending to not do the wrong thing, we may be leaving doors open, and we may be making it easier and easier for an attack to succeed, just because of user error of trying to move at light speed.
Yeah, if I may, I think that's a really interesting point, the whole psychology of this, right? I really haven't seen a lot of data on this, so I want to be careful here. I appreciate I'm going to be making some assumptions here. But the whole shift from out of the workplace into the home place, if you're not, when you're outside of work, there is almost a different psychology, right? When you're at home, my expectation is people are letting down their guard a little bit. Now, I have had some data on this. I have seen like phishing tests being far more effective, let us say, a lot more clickers nowadays. And the question is interesting. Why is phishing tests much more successful? Why have we seen, especially right at the beginning in the first 3 months of the pandemic, why did we see the attackers just ramp up their phishing attacks and keep it ramped up? Now, if they were not being effective, they would stop and they would adjust their attacks. But those phishing attacks remain very high. So I think it's reasonable to assume that they're being successful. And so how much of that has to do with psychology of the individual now not being in the workplace, being at home, and that home environment potentially letting down their guard, whether they're aware of it or not? I don't know the exact answer there, but it feels like there's something there.
Yeah, definitely. That is a very interesting point. And one on the human psychology side, and the second from a threat landscape side, where we've certainly seen a lot of threat actors say, heck, in times of turbulence and change, this is a great opportunity to get footholds, right? And so kind of taking this year of this madness and saying, how do I access now as many organizations as I can, and kind of lay the seeds for attacks that will play out over the next months and years and so on.
Yeah, what is that first quarter going to look like when everybody goes back to work?
Yeah.
Are we going to see a huge explosion of breaches? We may very well.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
Interesting.
And that,
Yeah.
I do want to add, I think it's also becoming much more personal. It used to be computers against computers and people against systems, and people used to joke, and how many folks have had the creds of hacking the system. But that's what we're seeing is attacking people, whether it's at home, whether it's at home email, whether it's social media, et cetera. I just see that trend is going to become the most successful way of getting into the things that you need to be successful as a hacker is get as close as you can to the people who have that access. So it's a overall trend that's a little disconcerting for me, right? As I look at it, I say, 5 years ago, it was different than it is today. And it's becoming, yes, there's highly technical tools, but they're tools. And the tools are there after that first thing, which is how do I get as close as I can to the people who do this today? Whether it's third-party vendors or internal threats, doesn't really matter. Internal threats are rarely malicious. They're just misused. So, at least in my opinion, I don't see a whole lot of folks taking money to be hackers. I see that their privileged access is being taken from them because they were clicky.
Clickers, the bane of our existence.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to when we think about landing in an organization. Our perspective at Illusive from various companies we see across the globe is that there are fundamental cyber hygiene issues which can and really must be resolved, because it seems we're making it way too easy for attackers once they're quote unquote within now is a kind of vague term, right? But once they have access to a machine on the network. And one thing that I think is common that we all feel is the challenge with identities, and especially around Active Directory and things of that nature. Can you share your experience? You've all done a lot to lock down your environments in a better way and to ensure that you are in a better status. Can you share some of your best practices and thoughts around that?
Well, one thing that I would highlight as a challenge is, so for an organization who has sort of dedicated itself to responsible privileged account management and having local admin rights, being stingy about those types of privilege, even at the end user workstation. When you overnight have a workforce population that is now remote, you have to change like your user support model. So users who just need simple software installs, or who may need support for a flickering monitor kind of. So now we have have we enabled like remote desktop support? Have we enabled local administration for software installation? And those activities, just to keep business operating, create a lot more opportunities for error. So even when we were rigorous about local administration management, that didn't really scale. It doesn't really scale. Or for example, can we create windows of time where local administration is valid and then it's deprovisioned again? And so even relatively minor errors in basically fixing a user's desktop environment, those minor errors turn into major security vulnerabilities. And when we're doing those things at scale and at speed, just the chances that we're missing something are just exponentially higher. And so that's where I think when we look at sort of our attack surface, the attack surface evaluation that one would do in a pen test. Historically, years ago, we would have done it once a year, twice a year kind of thing. That's relevant. If it's not nearly a continuous identification of those types of loose ends on hygiene, we're going to lose, because those loose ends are just at volume that need to be sort of resolved for us to keep up pace of business.
Yeah, reactive versus proactive, right? You have to be forward-leaning, aggressive, proactive, and unfortunately, for far too long, cybersecurity programs have been underserved, I guess we can say, in organizations. I think that's changing nowadays, but for a long time, not enough attention has been put on these important matters. The decision of, am I going to need to change how my business works versus implementing the security thing, whatever that is, process or technology, typically not changing the business argument one, right? And identity in Active Directory is one of those core pillars you've got to get right. And you can, right? You can do this, right? This is not something that we don't have frameworks, we don't have methods. There are ways to do this. This is not magic, right? Or this is not an unsolved problem. We know how to solve this. We know how to solve all of this. You just have to put a program together, scale it out, stage it out rather, and make the convincing argument and get it done. Identity is key to everything. Start with making sure your users aren't admin. Start there, right? Making sure your AD administrators, protect those domain admin creds. Make sure you don't have any unexpected privileges because you have nested groups, which is a major issue. Protect those domain admins, and then use a privilege access management tool so that passwords change frequently and you force checkouts and check-ins on those creds. You can do a lot just by, you can move the security ball a lot just by doing a couple simple things.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's something, just to add a little more color to that, is that this is the place of friction. It will be friction. So whether it's to the business, to a process, to a control, at some point, logging in is frictional. Everything that you do to shore that up will create security friction within your organization. Start thinking outside the box here. Start thinking about the fact that if you're too much friction, you'll wake up with shadow IT. If you're too little, you'll wake up with lateral movement. If you're out of the box and you're agile, you may just be stirring it up enough to where the changes that happen will be caught. So just say that when you talk about the Active Directory, controls are good, classic best practices are good, but time to start dusting off some unique thinking here, because every time you push forward to do something in here, you're going to get friction pushed back, or worse, you'll get workaround. So do the basics and then get really inventive here.
going for 4-factor authentication.
Well, conditional is a great point, right? Like
Yeah.
multi-factor, there's 1,000 ways around that, but conditions are conditions. They're either met or they're not. So there's a lot to it, right? And as you go through here, those conditions can lead you into some unique thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, striking that balance is absolutely critical. I'm not sure we'll embed that 4th factor of a polygraph.
I can't do that. Too much friction.
Facial recognition.
Like maybe a tad much there, but definitely striking that balance of what is actually achievable. Add some friction to your point, because if we try to make it frictionless totally, great, we save the day for today, and tomorrow we have a bad event. But on the flip side of that, if we disturb our user population all that much, that is an issue in its own right? So it's all about striking that balance. Awesome. Moving forward, you mentioned earlier, Carl, in regards to insider threats, and as you noted, there's 2 very different types of insider threats, right? Between the malicious insiders and the accidental insiders, both of which have become a concern. Thinking about this challenging period of working from home, it's our view that this threat becomes a whole lot more real, because people are tucked away and at home. They're not with their peers. They're somewhat emotionally detached to the company, not as much as not as attached as they were, at least previously. So we imagine that this surfaces a problem in a lot broader way. Is that reality? Is that something you're perceiving as well?
Yeah, so I think that's what we perceive, and I don't know how much of that is necessarily real. It's hard to measure, of course. But the first thing when I think about protecting against that threat is strongly considering sort of first not having users on network with access to resources with trust when it's not necessary. So I do think that there are a couple of really strong use cases for users who could sort of adopt either next generation VPN or SASE type solutions that allow users to access just the resources they need and never bring them onto the network, and never even give them the possibility of either misusing trust accidentally or otherwise. So I really want to limit the number of users to whom I'm sort of conferring any level of network trust on. That's the first part. And then the second part of that is just continuous testing, because if I'm able to sort of continually test whether those controls are effective, I have a confidence level in my controls that I can touch and feel, even though I may not have I may not have the kind of read on users and their behavior, and I can't see them anymore, and they may be doing things. They may be operating business in a pattern that I'm not familiar with because now they're at home. But if I have a comfort level with my controls and they're sort of tested every day and they're validated every day, then at least I know where my weaknesses are and what I need to shore up as a security team. So I think that's what I think about is first try to insulate the user from themselves by just not granting trust except where trust is necessary. And that's sort of a zero trust philosophy, and that's a sort of a loaded term, but I think it very much it has a lot of utility in just the way we think about eliminating vectors of attack is to reduce areas of trust when trust isn't necessary.
So yeah, that's a very interesting perspective, and certainly a very rising field. So you feel that the threat of insider threat is one that has promoted the notion of how do I get to zero trust? How do I advance the cause in that regard to also handle this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that what we're trying to do is reduce the attack surface. And so, the analogy of the shopping mall is we have a shopping mall that has one big door, and once you're in, you can go into all the stores. But while you're inside the mall, I trust you to sort of walk the hallways of the mall versus the mall where the store's doors are on the outside. So the shopper only comes into the store that they need to get into, but they never actually go inside the mall. I mean, that sort of dynamic changes the surface, for example, in shoplifting, and where you place your protective barriers, how much risk exposure you have. And so I think that at least that mental model, I think, is very useful. Technologies can employ that mental model in a variety of ways, But where we can employ that sort of philosophical approach, we start to shrink the surface that we really have to focus on. And when we can sort of shrink the surface and shrink the number of things that can go wrong, we can start to get better at those things that are a little more sophisticated. And so actually detecting lateral movement on core network, that's much more sophisticated. And it becomes a smaller problem to solve for than having all of the users sort of like on a trusted flat network.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Arlen, I imagine in thinking about law firms and access to so much sensitive data of so many different clients, especially at the magnitude and size that you guys are at, has insider threat become something that is more focused for you over these years, and especially in 2020?
Zero concern. Everyone is zero concern.
You sleep soundly at night.
But for everybody else, we'll talk about it. So yeah, of course, you know, every organization has to pay attention to this, and I would suggest that there's another way to kind of shape this a little bit, shape this conversation or argument. You're always going to get bad people, okay? For whatever reason, they get disgruntled. And especially in larger organizations, it's just a numbers game. You know, sooner or later you're going to have some bad apple, right? Okay, got it. And then the question becomes, you know, how do you set yourself up to identify, hopefully earlier in the cycle, but also prevent, right? There's all these good principles, right? People having the right access at the right time, least privilege, zero trust. These are not necessarily new concepts. How we're implementing them and how we're choosing to do that, of course, gets updated over time. But I'd suggest that you don't necessarily think of it that way. There are methodologies to identify when somebody may be going rogue. But if you acknowledge that bad guys, hackers, again, what is their 5-step process? Again, it's that phishing, and I'm going to take your creds, and I'm going to blend into the environment by using legitimate creds, right? This is not, yeah, of course they're using vulnerabilities, right? If you're not patched, they're going to leverage vulnerabilities in your environment. But one of the key things that they're doing is they're using legitimate creds, steal lateral, and then steal documents and steal data or implant whatever they want to implant. So in a way, that outsider becomes that insider, and that insider is now not trusted, right? So if you set up your program, and if you talk about your program in a way of, I want to stop identifying and stop these bad guys that are coming in, I suggest that that's a little bit more of an effective way of thinking about it and actually moving a program along. Because if you start with saying, I want to protect against the insider, the bad insider, you're actually getting, you're pushing up against some emotional resistance. Because most organizations, we think of ourselves as families. And nobody psychologically wants to say that my friend over there, my family over there is a bad guy. Right, so you're going to naturally butt up against some psychological resistance. So just think about it, and you protect against bad guy getting in, stealing creds, going lateral. And focus on that. You're actually going to solve both problems simultaneously for the most part. And I think it's a little bit more of an effective argument to actually make change in an environment.
Yeah, and I guess that helps also back to Carl's comment with the focus. And if we can focus the problem, there are so many problems out there. Where do we really put the focus? And if we can knock 2 birds with 1 stone, then obviously that's a
exactly
mechanism for us.
I think that there's another opportunity. So treat it like you would if this was a law enforcement thing. Get close to your customer, walk your beat. I think if you would ask the average user what our role is, most of them would say, you're here to protect the company. Are we? If you're the target, you're the person that they're trying to get a hold of, aren't we here to protect you, Mr. User, Mr. Insider Threat? And it has twofold. When you have a bad guy, they know you're right here. Hey, was this you? Is this what you're doing? Can we help you? Hey, is there anything we should be worried about? Make sure you check your home stuff. Talk to your family, right? When we become personal, it ceases to be the company. right? It
Yeah,
ceases to
that's
be
right.
more
Yeah.
about them. So the closer we get to our insider, the people with privileged identities, and the closer that they know, the more they know that these guys are just my bodyguards, and they're always going through asking questions and making sure we're good, the more likely they are to talk to you. And just like a beat cop, the safer the neighborhood becomes.
This sort of reminds me of a lively discussion I had with a network manager a couple of years ago, where essentially what I was attempting to do was to onboard his team into sort of a new methodology for administering for access to the network devices. And after a lot of pushback and back and forth, I sort of basically just said, and I said this kind of tongue in cheek, it's like, look, I don't care about you. I care about your identity. And I'm here to protect the identity that you use with privilege. So I think that what that was is it was perceived as a message originally as you're the threat. I'm trying to stop you from doing something, but shifting the conversation, say like, no, it's not you. It's your identity. Your identity is the thing that matters. And when we shifted that to the focus on the identity, not the person, it really sort of shifted the nature of the conversation about protecting the identity is something that we agreed on versus protecting the organization from the person. And so I think that was something that kind of coming back to this sort of identity, insider threat, to characterize this as the identity rather than the person, maybe depersonalizes it to the teams that otherwise would perceive it as an activity that is where they're the bad actor, which they're sometimes they are, but they're probably not. So
yeah, that's great, Carl. I'm stealing that.
That makes a lot of sense. And I've seen numerous organizations actually rebrand their insider threat program to insider protection, things of that nature, because to your point, if we come to it from a positive angle, it removes much of the friction that we addressed earlier. Cool. Arlen, you mentioned earlier in regards to anomaly detection that this has been a challenge in the COVID world, and makes all the sense in the world, right? Anomaly detection essentially implies that there is a normal. What kind of normal are we talking about? The normal of February or April or the summer or now, right? It's all changing so rapidly, and many of the solutions implemented over the last years were based on that kind of thesis and approach. And can we find a signal that is different from what it's supposed to be? How are you thinking about, and how should we be thinking about recouping some of those capabilities now that we can't baseline things in a good way?
Yeah, our behavioral, our tools, which relied heavily on behavioral analysis, quite a few of them became, let's just say, less effective shortly after in March. They've rebalanced and we're good to go now. And there's going to be, when we all return back to the office, there's going to have to be a relearning process on those tools. You're gonna, I assume everybody experienced a very high false positive rate shortly after in March when most of the US worked from home. So that was something, it took us, I'll be very frank, it took us off guard. We saw a couple of things come through our tools, which we hit the fire alarm. Everybody jumped on it, and we worked real hard to go, oh, okay, good, this is nothing, right? So there was a couple of those before we really got traction. Active defenses, yeah, absolutely active defenses. As much as you can be proactive, shift that. Cooper talked about shifting the battle space. As much as you can be proactive and get in front of something and be active as opposed to passive is the wrong word, but reactive, be proactive versus reactive, absolutely. Setting, I talked about setting the tripwires when we were talking about creds. That's an easy thing to do, right? How about fake processes running on your system? How about that database that is named, all of my financial sensitive data is here, please don't look here, right? Or something similar, right? You can gather some interesting traffic analysis, and you can see some interesting footprints by doing some simple things to ensnare bad actors in your web. So go out there, go get them.
I'd say create your own anomaly too. So let me elaborate. If the noise that we see, the way the attackers work, or they use a lot of threat intelligence, who to go for, and some of it's opportunistic. They'll broadcast thousands of emails, but most of the most successful ones, at least that I've seen, have been really targeted, crafted, organized, and piloted. And when that happens, it's because they have data, whether it's from third-party breaches like hotels that identify, certain folks in your organization, or it's just standard threat intelligence stuff, right? Where they'd come out and do open source intelligence on you. But regardless of how they get it, why not create your own anomaly? And I'll use the example Marlon just did. Why not put an ad for, if you use SAP, put one out for Oracle. Close it down right away. Now it's out there. Now they think to use Oracle, stand up an Oracle server, create your own anomaly, right? If the anomalies are no longer working for you based on user anomaly and network anomaly, fine, create them. And you would be surprised how people will use the latest and greatest bit of intelligence on you that they perused on the internet and got from you. And then they're going to use that to tune their attack. And if you give them what they want, you just created their anomaly. So it's I just say, that's going to be tough. That's why create your own.
Well, and I think that anomaly-based detection, sort of like compliance checks, are as a security team, if we're under operational constraints, we can't afford to waste time. We can't afford with false positive. We can't afford to invest capital into pushing the organization towards a pathway purely for compliance reasons, or purely because of a sort of legacy approach. So I think it's sort of imperative for us as a security team to say, like, we sort of like a deterministic, we know these things are active and reduce risk now. So in our priorities, if our priorities are armed with sort of active defense, testing, assessments, activities that are triggering, those should be top priority, because, to be honest with you, I just don't know that we have time to, we don't often have time to mess around with things that are not sort of critical. We don't have time to sort of agonize over things that may not end up reducing risk. And if we can identify that small universe of things like that, we know are definitively true, reduce our risk exposure, we absolutely should be focused on those things. And so behavioral based detection has been is valuable, but it's not. If we can establish a more determinate view on exactly what exposures we have, those then behavioral based anomaly detection, or like compliance checks on Active Directory configuration. Let's get to those. But let's get to those after we've sort of actually really assessed what the lateral movement risk is, reduce those activities, and then sort of to move down the hierarchy of sort of things to do. But they probably don't need to be our priority. We need to focus. That's why I think active defense is so essential, whether that's, automation and breach and attack simulation, whether that's sort of deployment of deceptions. Those give us a relatively small population of priorities, but they're real and they're active and they're deterministic. And that makes a big difference if I'm just sort of trying to prioritize my team's efforts.
They're real. I think that's the key, what you just said, right? They're real. If you have somebody knocking on one of your deceptions doors, pay attention, right? It's a low false positive rate, and we're all limited in the amount of time that we all have and what we can focus on. And if you can have a high confirmed positive rate tool or capability, jump at it.
Yeah, I find it funny that at the end of the day, what is deceptive is real, right? That is the takeaway. You would kind of expect the opposite, but totally makes a lot of sense. Moreover, even if we had enough people to handle vast amount of false positives, back to the psychological elements of people, there is a threshold of how many false positives a human can encounter and not get that alert fatigue and look over the next one and the real true positive, right? And that is not a small gap to solve for because we're wired that way, right? That's how our brains work. So it is certainly a big challenge. Great. For our final question, I know that you all brought with you your crystal ball. And so when we kind of look into the future, given what we've learned over this last year, we made some rapid changes. Some of them will have to sustain and be with us for a while. Some other changes we may want to implement. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where the world is going, where security is going in that world, and what we should do to get ahead of that.
Well, I guess
I'll
I'll start.
You're courageous. Good.
Yeah, so I'm about to share a metaphor with a committee later today. So I'll try it out here first, which is that if 2020 was a hurricane of cyber threat activity, then I think that where we are kind of post-election through the holidays is probably the eye. Things maybe calm down a little bit, but what 2021 offers for us sort of from a threat perspective is kind of anyone's guess on the flip side of the new year. And so I think of like this period of maybe we think of the holiday season as a little bit of a lull, and I think actually we probably see a little bit of alert drop since the last couple of weeks. I think those short-term strategies, it's aggressive active defense. It's looking at some real basic privileged account management, lockdown. So if there's a couple of things in particular on the user edge that we anticipate putting in place right about the first of the year to close up those gaps. And so what I'm trying to sort of paint for the organization is that that we may sort of psychologically feel like 2020 is over, this big surge of change is over, but careful to don't underestimate 2021. And so I am trying to use this sort of window of time in the holiday season to pinpoint a couple of things that we might just move real fast on to try to close a couple of doors, expecting 2021 to pan out like 2020 or worse. But that's obviously speculation, but who knows? And I don't think it's reasonable for us to assume that 2021 is going to be a depressurized time by any stretch. So,
I totally agree. One of the things that I love about this work is that it's constantly changing. It's what I've always loved about security and technology before that. What we've seen just over time is just the acceleration of change, not only in technology and how businesses work, but also how the bad guys are coming after us, right? It's that constant change, and if you're not comfortable with change and agile thinking, wrong job, right? To your point, I only see that accelerating. And so what do I see in 2021? More of everything. And if when we saw the shift from work to home, we saw organizations that weren't prepared, that didn't have the groundwork already set. They struggled really hard, and they still are. They had to poke holes in their security fabric. And we all know that some of the most permanent things in IT were once called temporary, right? Those organizations that had to poke holes in their security fabric, be it from a technology or process side, will very likely be living with those holes for a while. So I think if your organization has not already set a good foundation in your security program, you're going to struggle. We're going to struggle real hard, and we're going to see more and more breaches of those types of organizations. Now, we just saw with FireEye. We all saw the announcement. So even very strong organizations can get breached. We know that. But I think the takeaway here is you got to work hard now because the future is not going to give you a respite, not going to give you a chance. Get it done now so that you're better prepared for tomorrow.
think I'll add a little more color to both of those comments, and that from expect, want to get it from a people perspective, expect for it to become more personal. From a technology perspective, expect it to move to the latest. What I mean is APIs, right? Your cloud, right? But how many shared keys are sitting on text files and notebooks and Outlook notepads, right? How many things are out there that you're just not looking for that you will be looking for in 2021 because it'll be the quickest way to make some money. And quite honestly, there's changes happening regulatory. I mean, like we talked about ransomware. You know, one of the things that really shocked me was a couple of months ago, we saw from the U.S. government saying, don't pay ransomware, and if you do, and it tends to be one of these sanctioned countries, will come after you. Well, there went an entire section of my toolbox, right? So what do you mean? And how do I know? And how are you going to know? And what, right? So you're going to see more confusion around it because ransomware in and of itself, I think in a couple of months this year made more money than oil. So if you look at it where there's money, there's going to be more. Where there's more, it's going to become whatever's the quickest and easiest to get in and get out, because that's what you do in business, and ransomware is a business. And that's going to become personal, and it's going to focus on things that get them there the quickest. So you have to have an outward facing, we're going to be doing these things, and you have to continue to improve what you know is broken. And on the other side, you need to back away from the table and go, let's start asking questions about what we don't know. Right? Because I think you'll find if you take your talent and you ask them, how would you do this? They would probably open up a few doors that you didn't know existed. And that's my advice, is be ready for the next flex. Because if one thing this thing has shown us this year is that it has been agile in the way that they do it. And who's doing it? My last prediction on this is the attackers are no longer competing, they're working together. What does that mean? At January, if we had a vulnerability on an external site and it got breached, they sometimes patched it to keep the other guys out because we were a commodity. Today, we're selling it to each other.
I always love it when the bad guys are patching devices to keep other guys
Isn't it
out.
crazy? Yeah.
I love it, right? Yeah, you know, from a prediction, a crystal ball, I'm waiting for bad guys to really use AI and ML to dynamically attack organizations, right? So put your tools against the organization and have it constantly, and taking the people aspect out of it a little bit, the person attacker, and using AI and ML to breach organizations. I think that's going to be an interesting wave coming up fairly soon.
Oh, very. And that'll just push the importance of time to detect, time to respond down
Absolutely.
to nanoseconds, because they can't afford, once it's automated, to do. You can't afford to rely on humans. Absolutely. Great comments, everybody. So first of all, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. We'd like to move on over to the Q&A portion. So we have some questions in, which I'll start off with. At the same time, for the audience, feel free to shoot any additional questions in the Q&A box in your Zoom, and we'll address them one by one. So first question is regarding the FireEye news. Any thoughts on the attack itself, or how this impacts us as companies and customers of FireEye?
Well, if I could, I don't want to ever throw dirt on somebody for getting a compromise, but the rest of the security vendors now have to basically update IOCs. And so, whether we have, from Symantec and Palo Alto and Cisco and Microsoft and Cybereason and everybody who has to update IOCs, I think that we should be thinking to ourselves, if we're reliant on that, we're in trouble. And so that's where I think, like, if we're thinking about active defense strategies, they aren't reliant on IOCs. So the degree to which we can protect our networks, if we're dependent on that, like, patch cycles, IOC update cycles, the more reliant we are on those things, the more likely we are to fail. And so that's where I think active defense deception really plays a pivotal role, because it doesn't rely on that kind of You know, I'm not dependent on the vendor for updates, and that's a big differentiator in terms of the effectiveness of the controls that we can put in place in the deception play.
Patch, patch, patch. Patch, patch, patch. IOCs are like signatures, AV signatures. You need them, they're good. And if you're relying on them, you're toast.
We have this thing. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Just real quick. If you take a look at all the CVEs that FireEye published on their GitHub page, all of them are known bones. They said very clearly there were no 0 days in their toolkit. Okay. Well, if you're patching, you're okay, right? If you're doing basic good cyber hygiene, you're very likely okay, right? Now, that doesn't mean that's the only thing you need to do, but patch, patch, patch. Close those vulns. If you're not closing your vulns, you're just asking for trouble. I'm sorry, Cooper, go ahead, please.
No, that's probably one of the best things you could say, is that if you're not patched, it'll happen in minutes. If you are patched, it'll happen in days. That's our experience. The things that weren't patched, from the time you get compromised, it's instantaneous. That's the first thing they do. Now, my comment that I wanted to add here was around that we look at IOCs as being things that you do to secure alarms and locks on windows and doors. We look at active defense as evidence that a compromise has happened. So it's the difference between having an alarm on a window and seeing that the window's been broken with muddy footprints going inside. You react differently between the alarm went off on window 3 than you would there's the alarm went off, the window's been broken, and there's a motion detection inside that room. It's a completely different reaction. And so as you move through, you start looking at the evidence of the compromise and the evidence of the attacker over the IOCs. And so you get these, and you have to do them because you have to put alarms on windows, you have to lock doors. But your reaction to what happens when those get rattled and get hit or get moved is what matters, especially if they're vulnerable.
Yeah, and by the way, just for what it's worth, our view at Illusive, where our hearts are out with FireEye, because to the comments made earlier, it can happen to any firm. We know nobody is 100% protected, and we know they're contributing a lot to the community and doing great work. And I think as a community, we need to strengthen them in these challenging times. As noted earlier, the attackers are working together. They're doing a better job than we are in working together, and we have to fortify in numbers. Moving on to the next question, will there be a demo of how Illusive solution will identify a ransomware attack? Jumped for me. Contain the attack, remediate the infection options. No, we won't be doing a demo in this session, but certainly feel free to visit our website. I think we also have here on the screen where you can contact us for a demo, and obviously we'd love to show you what it is that we're about. There seems to be a trend toward detection over protection. What tips the scales for you? I think that's kind of along the lines, Cooper, of what you were mentioning on the...
It's shaping the battlefield.
On the alarm, yeah.
It really is. It's the only, so you can, there's always going to be IOCs, and they're going to change. And some of the ones from 2017 we're still dealing with today. Some of them from 2010. That noise is never going to go away, and it is something you're going to have to deal with. But the one thing that the deception will get you is the ability to fight in your way with what you want. So identify things that matter. Funnel the people into the right attack areas. And you can get, without hacking back, that's a big thing nobody wants to talk about. When they're in your environment, you can do whatever you want to do. Take that to heart, right? They're in your environment. Think about the amount of intelligence you can gather from that, right? So as you move through this, remember, you can create an aviary. We call it a serpentarium, where you keep snakes, but watch them, right? You can do this. You can do things to people that are inside your wire, because now they're on your turf. And that's why we talk so much about deceptions, because those garner so much more results during an incident than 2,000 pages of anomalies. Be quite honest. Now, you still need those because those are forensics and those help you track and those give you better data and it lets you know where your deceptions weren't good. So it's, again, they're foundational. But the things that in my opinion, that drive the most about driving the attacker into places that matter is allowing them to be successful where you want them to be and denying them otherwise.
I'm just going to repeat what Cooper said. Yes, everything he said.
Additional question regarding anomaly detection. So regarding behavioral anomaly detection, we can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we need to develop ways for systems to retrain themselves or widen the funnel, such that we're looking across a wide swath of systems, areas, etc. How can non-mathematician security types sort of address this conundrum on the blue side?
Well, I think there are use cases where behavioral anomaly detection is just sort of inherently necessary. So like if I'm looking for employees like within an application downloading an unusual amount of file, or employees who maybe pose a flight risk because they're going to certain sites and sending their resumes, those types of things, there is no doubt that there are those types of user behaviors that can only be detected through more of an anomaly or based on a baseline of behavior. So what I would suggest is that there are use cases though for like domain admins, privileged accounts, local admins. There are certain types of activities where you can employ a deterministic approach that's far more effective and concrete in terms of its results of detection without false positives. So I think when it comes to behavioral detection, it's not that behavioral detection doesn't have a place, but I think what we maybe need to think about is are we asking our telemetry to give us behavioral detection all over the place, where it's really good at some things, but it's not good at everything. And maybe we're just setting our expectations for where we apply behavioral detection and then where we apply a deterministic approach, because I think both are absolutely valid, but they each have a context for when they're going to be most useful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not one or the other. It's all the above. And you just have to make choices where you're applying different strategies. It's just that, it's not one or the other. I assume it doesn't work very well today, but one of the things that I love implementing is behavioral analysis on authentication. So individuals authenticating, right? Somebody's out of my Dallas office and I'm seeing authentications, at 12 o'clock in Dallas, but then at 1 o'clock out of London. That's interesting. Where I see a badge swipe in Paris, but then an authentication in New York. That's interesting. I haven't invented teleportation yet. So that's interesting, right? And this is very, very simple behavioral analysis type stuff. But if you focus it all gets back to your use cases, right? Build your use cases. What are you looking for? And be very specific and focused in not only the tools that you're deploying, but also how you're setting up your alerts. And you're going to be able to reduce a lot of your false positives, noise, and allow you to focus on the right things by having a thoughtful approach rather than just dropping, every log into your SIM. Don't do that. That's expensive.
We'll add a little from the trenches. My team tells me that this particular, the behavioral piece has been the best at identifying misconfiguration. It's the thing that sends off the alarms on, we opened that up on accident, or we did something. It's almost every single time. It's been, oops, we forgot to apply the hardening on that box or something along those lines, because it's rarely around an IOC that it lends itself to a compromise as much as it is an attempted compromise. Or why is that doing that? Oh, it connected these two networks and they weren't supposed to, right? So it's not something you throw away. It's something that helps you find the 8 out of 10 reasons you get hit, which is a misconfiguration, right? At least from the initial access, but in my opinion. But I think it's a good thing. Don't throw it out.
Vulns and config. Yeah, vulns and misconfig. That's your leading cause. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll take one final question as we come up to the time here. With respect to these big ransomware attacks, clearly existing security SEC solutions, DR and others haven't been successful in completely stopping these attacks. What else can be done from a technology side?
It's a
You're smiling there, Cooper.
well, so technology is being used against you, right? So there must be a technology solution, and there is. It's a complex, because everything built by man can be taken down by man. So it depends. If it's an automated thing, you got it. You got 20 tools in the bucket today that'll do that. If it's piloted, there's a reason it's piloted. Technology isn't always going to be the answer. So many cases, you're going to have to hope the pilot makes a mistake, or get them to make a mistake. Again, if you're being passive and you're waiting to see how you can see it so that you can stop it, good luck. So,
And I'd throw in there that testing is sort of existential here, because like let's say that you've made the change to disable SMB version 1 or LLMMNR on the network. You've made those changes, but are we sure? Like, do we know? Did we test ourselves that avenue is still not sort of susceptible? Or if we patched last weekend, are you sure? Do we still have a set of agents that failed on the endpoints, and so that patch never went through, and it's going to be 6 months before that server is rebooted in the data center, and so in that period of time, it's still susceptible. So I would just suggest that without sort of a continuous sort of testing regime, and that's active defense. Without that testing in place, we take almost on articles of faith that the patch worked, or that the configuration change to disable the deprecated protocol worked. Prove it to yourself. Have your teams should be testing themselves and asking themselves the question: how do I prove that this isn't going to work now? And that's what I think what an active defense mindset is to not trust the controls, but get a second opinion, and the second opinion is a test. So
yeah. Mine's a three-parter. It's aggressively patch, deploy EDR, and enable active defense. It's those three. Yeah, and the last one is about improving visibility and increasing your accuracy of identifying bad as early in the attack chain as possible. Give yourself a chance.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, gentlemen, as we've come up on the time here, I want to thank you a lot. This was a fascinating discussion. You brought some really interesting ideas to the table, so appreciate you sharing it with all of us. At the same time, for our audience, like to thank everybody for participating and joining, and wishing us all a better 2021. Maybe a bit less of a roller coaster, and hopefully we get back to some sort of stability in the world, and happy holidays to everyone. Thank you very much.
thank you.